Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome back to the Land and Climate Podcast. My name is Alasdair McEwen, and in this episode, we thought we'd follow up with environmental historian from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., Professor Dagomar Degroot, about a subject mentioned in our previous podcast with him, on how regime change and even societal collapse can be influenced by climate change. It is only relatively recently that academics have begun to look at the influence of climate and the environment on regime and societal changes, and so we thought we'd explore this issue in more detail. We're also planning a future episode where we have essentially a case study talking to historian Timothy Brooke about his research into the changing climate's influence on the collapse of the Ming dynasty in China.
History is full of examples of profound regional droughts. And as we're heading into the future, drought seems to be becoming a lot more common, more severe.
Back to the current episode, though, I started by asking Dagomar Degroot for historical examples of regime collapse and societal collapse to better understand the terms.
The two best case studies have been the destruction of the late classical Mayan city-states about 1,000 years ago, and the disappearance of the Vikings, or in other words, the Norse, in Western Greenland by about 600 years ago. So these are probably the two most charismatic examples. There's been scholarships swirling around them for at least 50 years, in the case of the Norse, more than 100 years. And in both cases, we have something quite similar, where there seems to be a relatively abrupt disappearance, and that's really key. A collapse has to happen suddenly. It can't be a long, drawn-out, centuries-long process. No, it's almost got to be like a switch goes off. It's sudden, it's mysterious. In the case of the Norse, literally, the question is, where are the bodies? We don't have the bodies from the Viking settlements in Greenland. It's got to correlate with a period of climatic change. So in the case of the late classical Mayans, long period of drought. And in the case of the Norse, all kinds of stuff seems to be happening. Certainly a kind of cooling with the onset of what's called the Little Ice Age, period of natural climatic cooling brought about by volcanic eruptions maybe, or changes in solar output, or both. But also in Greenland, there seems to be a drought, even sea level increases, an increase in storming. So a bunch of bad things are happening in Greenland that you could conceivably tie to bad times for the Norse there. But with the Mayans, drought really turns out to be probably the most important driver of these collapses. Historically, there's other examples like the collapse of Angkor, which is one of the great cities, urban areas in pre-industrial history. It's in present-day Cambodia. It's the capital of the Khmer Empire. Angkor Wat is the temple complex at the center of it. This is a huge hydraulic city. And over the course of the 15th century, it's abandoned. The hydraulic city ceases to work as well when there's not a lot of rainfall. And in periods of really extensive drought, this thing seems to be pretty much abandoned. So there's a correlation there between drought and the abandonment. A hydraulic city, it's a city that really depends on canals for irrigation, transportation, and the flow of information. So that's another example. The Assyrian Empire, the Akkadian Empire, ancient empires that seem to have collapsed, unraveled, and cities even abandoned during periods of profound drought. Historically, those are other examples. And even before Ptolemaic Egypt, actually, when there were droughts that dried out the Nile and kept it from flooding, really, that seems to have been a cause of uprisings, not so much civilizational collapse, but certainly tough times for the Egyptians. The Western Roman Empire is another great example where its collapse correlates with cooling and a drying trend punctuated by extreme years in the 6th century CE that wrecked harvests and left people more vulnerable to outbreaks of epidemic disease like the plague of Justinian, the argument goes. And so here again, we see a correlation between climatic cooling, drought, most importantly perhaps, and the weakening of an empire, or at least part of an empire. So there's all these case studies. There's no shortage of them. There seems to be more with every passing year. And in every case, there's a correlation between cooling, often drought, and periods of low harvests, and then what seems to be a sudden abandonment of existing social structures and population centers. And usually it seems like the abandonment is caused by mortality events, though not always.
I think you're pointing towards common elements in societal collapses. One of the things that you mentioned there was droughts, water shortages. If we're going back to today, we're talking about, albeit in the longer term, we're in a cooling period in the history of the world, but now we're in a heating period. Are there parallels we can draw between the two, given that most of what you've mentioned there has been related to cooling?
That's always the argument in scholarship of climate's history, because when we look at that scholarship for 300,000 years, when things got really bad for most people is when there was cooling, either abrupt cooling, usually of a smaller magnitude, or extreme long-term cooling, like the onset of glacial periods. And in fact, actually going back to these case studies of collapses, my personal favorite is the collapse of whole species of hominins, like the Neanderthals. Neanderthals went extinct during the last glacial period, and there's a good reason to believe their extinction was caused by climatic cooling. So yes, there's often a correlation, at least, and we can talk about causation maybe in a little bit, but a correlation between periods of cooling and potential collapses. That drought, right, is perhaps even more significantly correlated to these terrible times for civilizations. And the drought is something we're already seeing as more extensive now and going forwards. Historically, often we're looking at regional droughts. Why do those droughts happen? Because temperatures change. And in particular, the temperature, let's say, relative of the northern hemisphere relative to the southern hemisphere may change. And that can alter precipitation patterns. Most importantly, the thermal equator can shift. So the area where there's the most solar heating, when that happens, there's like a belt of rains that usually roughly straddles the equator, but it can go a little further north or south. That can then bring just terrible droughts to places, decades-long droughts. That's just one example of why you might get regional droughts historically that can be really devastating for civilization. History is full of examples of profound regional droughts. And as we're heading into the future, drought seems to be becoming a lot more common, more severe. There's different reasons for that. One of them is that in a hotter world, there's more evaporation, and a hotter atmosphere can hold more water. So you might get much stronger droughts going forwards. And the past can provide a warning, because where there's been catastrophic droughts in the past, often we do see that societies, that population centers can unravel. In terms of temperature, what matters when the climate cools is that the cooling affects how you can get stuff from your environment, basically, right? So if it gets a lot colder, you might not be able to harvest easily fewer crops. Cold snaps wreck plants, keep them from growing or interrupt their growth. That's the same way, though, when it gets hot enough, right? If it gets too hot, then plants also have trouble growing. So either way, whether it's cooling below a certain threshold or warming above a certain threshold, the effect is actually quite similar. You're not growing enough food. That's really bad for human populations. Even though it seems like the opposite, cooling versus warming, either way, you're leaving a safe space for different populations in different environments. And history tells us that can be very dangerous.
I also wanted to go into not just societal collapse and change in a societal system, but also the change of regime in Madagascar, for example, recently in October, I think it was this year. I don't think there have been many political analyses which have pointed, I mean, I could be wrong here, but there haven't been too many which have pointed that explicitly to climate change. And many of these political analyses are actually going much more into the particular regime that existed, the corruption, etc., that was perhaps going on in society, in the government. But there aren't that many references to that. And I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that as well in this discussion.
Well, this actually points to the difficulty of linking climate to distinct political disasters or even the wholesale collapse of civilization. And you see that now, I think, probably most strongly with Iran. Iran is going through a horrible water crisis. Tehran is running out of water. And the question as well is this a climate crisis then, right? And actually, I'm reminded also of the Syrian civil war. There's a lot of controversy about this, but there does seem to have been drought in certain areas, in agricultural areas, that then help to drive some level of migration, internal migration Some have argued that that was destabilizing. The question here is it a climate-driven collapse if a regime has made its society vulnerable to drought, much more vulnerable than it would have been? And both in Iran and in Syria, that's what we see, right? We see these authoritarian regimes that overexploited groundwater. In the case of Iran, in order to insulate itself from American pressure by growing more wheat in Iran, and the crops then are sensitive, they require a lot of water. Where do you get that water from? You pour it out of your groundwater, you deplete your supplies, and eventually the bill comes due because the groundwater does not replenish itself quickly enough. So when you do get a drought, whereas you could have depended on groundwater in the past, you don't have that anymore. And now you're really vulnerable. So the question then is, are we seeing an example of a regime that has just failed profoundly to insulate itself from weather events that it should have been protected from? Or are we seeing a climate-driven collapse? I would probably lean towards the former, honestly, rather than the latter. And frankly, the same thing is happening in the United States now, where there's overexploitation of groundwater on a vast scale throughout the Midwest. And eventually the bill's going to come due and there's not going to be enough food. So historically, we see many examples of that tendency in the 15th century. Is this an example of a climate-driven collapse, or was this always a precarious situation where you have a hydraulic city established in an area where you can get mega droughts, even with natural climatic variability? So, who's to blame? Is it the mega drought that's responsible for the destruction of the city, or is it just unsustainable practices? I would, again, probably lean towards the unsustainability of human arrangements.
And do you think that there perhaps isn't enough analysis or enough acceptance of that point?
What I would say is that analyses, and this is so often the case with any climate scholarship and climate media, analyses tend to be grouped around two extreme sets of explanations. And that's historically the case when we look at these historical case studies as well. So one explanation then is, okay, everything is because of climate change. And we saw that with the Syrian civil war. This is a climate conflict. This is, in fact, a warning for the future, because drought is destabilizing a civilization, because it's making people migrate from the countryside into the outskirts of cities where they don't have enough services and there's already overcrowding. And that's where people rise up against their government. That's a very clear example of a climate-driven collapse. Now, it turned out to be way more complicated than that, because in point of fact, a lot of the migration was not happening because of drought. Drought actually affected a relatively small number of migrants, and violence did not break out in the outskirts of cities. So there's a whole bunch of links in this causal chain that turned out to be much less compelling than initially believed. But that was a whole set of explanations about why the Syrian civil war happened. And then other sets of explanations don't take into account drought, weather, climate. It's either everything's because of climate or nothing's because of climate. We have a real trouble also when we're examining the past, combining different explanations in a sort of multi-causal, nuanced explanation for why things happen. And that's been a big part of my scholarship over the years, trying to develop more convincing, what I consider to be more convincing explanations for why history played out as it did, that incorporate climate, but don't necessarily make it the be-all, end-all. It's just one factor among many. And frankly, when I think about the present, that's how I understand climate. If you go to Madagascar, it's one factor among many that are responsible for destabilizing a regime. That might not be the case going forward, because climate change continues to get worse, and there may be a threshold past where it becomes the dominant force unraveling societies.
Does existing research give us any indicators of where we can look for societal collapse next? I mean, you've pointed to a few of these things that already. You've talked about the US, but there are quite a few studies which show that the global south is actually more vulnerable to climate change and to those consequential impacts of that. Can we then say, therefore, that the global south is more likely to experience societal or governmental collapse?
There's been reams of studies now that have suggested that people who are already marginalized in the global community, and that includes much of the global south, particularly parts of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, that are dependent on rain-fed agriculture, or parts of the Middle East where climate change is expected to have very severe impacts on the availability of water, those areas might be most susceptible to large-scale mortality events, including famine, government breakdown, and societal collapse in a warmer future. At the same time, I tend to be a little bit skeptical of some of those arguments. And the reason for that is that I think when society comes to depend more and more on exquisite infrastructure and delicate global flows of commodities, and we saw this actually during the pandemic, how much we depend on extremely efficient global flow of materials that doesn't actually stay in one place for any length of time. It moves very, very quickly from where it's produced to where it's consumed, and often it's produced in the same handful of places. And my fear then is that areas that have much more infrastructure and that are more connected to these global flows might end up being actually more vulnerable than ostensibly poorer regions in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa that might be less plugged into these flows. So, and I think about this a lot with my space research as well, with solar storms, for example, is something that I've been really writing and working on lately, where the areas that are most vulnerable to those catastrophes, solar storms that can knock out power grids, are precisely those areas that are most electrified. Places that, like in the American Northeast, highly connected to large-scale electrical grids that extend across the country. So I wouldn't be too sure that areas that are richer are necessarily less vulnerable than areas that are poorer.
You've got a forthcoming book which looks at human resilience and explores and documents how human societies have coped with environmental and climate shifts in the past. Can we talk a little bit more about the resilience aspect in these huge societal changes?
So resilience, much like collapse, is a loaded term. And it's loaded in part because there's a long history of fossil fuel companies using this concept in order to reduce support for climate action. They might say, for example, and there's ads to this effect in the 1980s, even in 1990s, we can be resilient in the face of climate change. We don't have to worry about it. Americans have always been resilient in the face of weather. We can deal with whatever the future has in store. That's pretty problematic because it depends how bad climate change gets, of course. And if you just keep burning fossil fuels, it's going to get so bad that you can't be resilient to it no matter what. So there's a very loaded term. Resilience tends to imply that when you experience a severe weather event and you take a lot of damage, it's your fault. You haven't been resilient enough. And so in that sense, it tends to take attention away from the actual reasons that weather events might be getting more severe, which is, of course, global warming. Global warming is the fault of the United States, China in particular. Rarely it's the fault of local communities, especially in the global south. So resilience has a number of problematic political aspects, for sure. I think that's really important when you're doing public research. You don't want to introduce a bunch of jargon that people aren't immediately familiar with. So even if you can accept, resilience is a problematic term, basically if someone uses that term, you know what they mean. But if I use a term like irresilience, or there's been a whole bunch of proposed words to use instead of resilience, people immediately tune you out, especially in today's media environment. As you know, if you're not saying something, relatively quickly, you lose your audience. So for that reason, I still use resilience. It's also used by policy professionals all the time. And one of the main ambitions I have is to make history speak to policy development. So in other words, how can we leverage the past in order to inform climate adaptation policy? And I can't do that unless I speak the language of policy professionals. Resilience is one of the words that they use. So for that reason, I still use resilience. And again, the definition that we use is this definition of bouncing back, of minimizing damage, and of changing yourself enough that you can cope with climatic extremes, but not so much that you lose who you are. Resilience is not always a good thing. In fact, in many cases, historically, it's been a very bad thing. And there's two main reasons for that. One is that the resilience of a community, of a society, can entrench really problematic power relationships between groups, really problematic political systems. You might not want a brutal authoritarian regime to be resilient, Many historical regimes have been brutal authoritarian regimes. For example, you can see the history of Imperial China. But you can choose any empire, really. You can make a strong case that it was much better to live in a small hunter-gatherer community than a rigidly stratified and authoritarian regime, which is what most historical empires were. The only protection you had from that regime is that centralized power was always really quite weak historically. So the state could never really reach all the way, or had a difficult time reaching all the way into your lives the way that 20th century authoritarian states could do, or 21st century. But even so, with these authoritarian states, it was often better for them to collapse. We see, for example, after the Western Roman Empire collapsed, for the people who were left, life was often better. Their heights actually increase, so they had more nutrition. Historically, it was bad for the regime to be too stable. There's a labor historian known as E.P. Thompson. He has this quote that I use a lot. And the quote is, "Stability no less than revolution can have its own form of terror." I think that certainly applies here.
I'm looking for indicators of where we could predict future collapse. You mentioned the northeastern US, for example, as having quite a developed infrastructure, which was therefore vulnerable. Up until recently, there has been a democratic regime. But if we're looking to China, for example, do you think it might be more easily vulnerable to collapse? And is it possible to say that with authoritarian regimes or make that generalization?
Well, the first thing to explore is whether collapse affects large, complex states historically. We should probably examine whether climate change causes collapse. And then once we've established those two things, I think we could explore whether a collapse owing to climate change could happen in the future. And all of these things are controversial. There's lots of different opinions on them. So can collapse happen historically? Well, it depends a lot on how you define it. So if by collapse you mean regime change, of course we see that all the time throughout history. Right? So yes, the answer there is clearly yes. If by collapse you mean that population centers can be abandoned, or that many people within a population center can die, well, we see plenty of evidence for that too. I mentioned Angkor a few times now. Rome is another good example. I've mentioned Western Roman Empire now. At its peak, in the 1st century CE, Rome had over 1 million people. And by the time you get to 700s to the 800s, there are maybe 10,000 people left. And you have to imagine 10,000 people in the shadow of these spectacular structures that can no longer be built, right? Technology has been lost. It must have been a profoundly eerie experience. So yes, we know that depopulation can happen, but has an entire civilization unraveled to such an extent that nothing's left, basically, which is really what we're talking about. When we say climate-driven collapse, ultimately, I think that's kind of what we mean. There's not a lot of evidence for that. And you think about the late classical Mayans, yes, it does seem like an existing way of life was lost in many city-states. But at the same time, there are more Mayans alive now than there ever have been historically, and Mayan culture endures. So can we really say then that this form of collapse in fact happened? Now, when we look at the Norse in Greenland, it's true that everybody seems to disappear in Greenland. But we're talking about a population in the thousands. And we don't know really if they left. Some died, but we don't know completely what happened to that population. To me, it doesn't seem like a civilizational collapse so much as a very localized depopulation event. There's not a lot of historical evidence for large civilizations just completely coming undone without a trace, their people vanishing, their culture disappearing. There's not a lot of historical evidence for that, which is actually quite a profound thing if you think about it. It shouldn't really surprise us because we are still here. So human history has to be an example. It has to be mostly a story of resilience and adaptation rather than collapse, because otherwise there wouldn't be 8 billion of us, number one. But number two, I think it's quite profound because once things get started by our species, they have a tough time ending. Resilience is not necessarily a good thing for two reasons. One reason is that it can entrench a political system that's devastating to ordinary people. But the other reason actually is that resilience often comes about from one population exploiting another population. So you might have resilience of a government that masks the vulnerability of ordinary people. This is what happened in the Dutch Republic. It's what I've written about a little bit, where you've got ordinary people who can suffer enormously from flooding and from violence around the edges of the Republic, but people within cities and coastal areas really experience a lifestyle that few others do globally. But you can also have rich people preying on the poor. And the best example of this is the colonial depredations of the 17th and 18th centuries, where some of the wealth, even in places like Amsterdam or London, comes from the slave trade, right? So it's kind of the ultimate example of people oppressing others, that creating wealth, and the wealth then actually making these societies more resilient in the face of climatic change, the little ice age, than they had been. But there's many different examples that we've now are uncovering historically of rich populations being resilient, having enough food because they're draining resources from poorer populations. And then there's the examples of plunder, of, for example, pastoralists raiding into the communities of agriculturalists, which happens all the time in different parts of the world, but perhaps most famously along the northern frontier of historical China, where you've got these raids, people carrying off plunder, usually agricultural commodities, and that being an example of them being resilient, them adapting, for example, to drought on the backs of other people. So resilience historically can be a really toxic thing for a number of different reasons.
You've spoken about some of the modern aspects of space exploration and how they could be quite negative and they could be quite self-centered around certain individuals exploiting space resources, etc. And do you think that there is a psyche which is preparing for a future heating world where there is a development of that, the resilience is in fact being developed for those people?
The exploitation of resources in outer space is something that can be connected to efforts to make humanity more resilient in the face of global warming, or even to mitigate global warming. And there's a number of different reasons for that. One could be that you could create clean power in outer space and beam it to Earth. That's quite a benign reason. You could plausibly create a solar shade that blocks 1 or 2% of incoming solar radiation and helps cool the Earth. It's kind of a relatively benign geoengineering solution. Sometimes you hear that wealthy tycoons like the likes of Elon Musk want to escape Earth for Mars so that the rich will be able to leave, but all of the rest of us are stuck on this warming planet. No matter what happens pretty much on Earth, you could have a nuclear war. It's going to be a way better place to live than Mars for the foreseeable future.
Thanks very much again to Dagomar Degroot for his time. As always, there's a further reading list on this topic, which you can find in our podcast blurb. And as I mentioned before, in a future episode, I will be talking to Canadian historian Timothy Brooke on his book about the impact of climate change on the collapse of the Ming Dynasty in China, The Price of Collapse. So do look out for that soon. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast, please do try to leave us a review, as it will help others to find us, and also do follow the podcast if you haven't already. You'll also find fresh pieces to read on our Land and Climate Review website. And thanks to Vasco Kostovsky for audio engineering the show, and Bertie will be back again in a fortnight. I'm Alasdair McEwen, and thanks for listening.